this video, let's take a look at installing the transmission input shaft assembled into the Nissan RE4R01A automatic transmission with its bell housing, with the reverse clutch drum, its braking band for stopping the drum, the front high clutch drum and its hub with the needle roller bearing and the race placed inside the clutch drum assembly. So we can see we have 3 dowels that has to be placed into the hole for holding this race in position so the hub can be able to rotate. The other part is this sun gear, and this will be installed against the reverse drum. When it's installed, it will be locked together like this. We also have this front planetary carrier, and this is going to be installed as a lid, like placing it on a pot. This top is going to have to drop all the way down to here when it's seated on the overrun forward clutch drum assembly. Let's take a look at assembling all these parts outside of the transmission before we do so. So this sun gear will ride against this needle roller bearing. It's a thrust bearing, and that will be placed like this with the smooth side on the inside of the forward drum assembly. Once we have this in location, then our next part would be to place this sun gear, and we see it has also another race with 4 dowels, and that we want to place on this needle roller bearing with the sun gear inside the planetary. Careful attention must be taken that the race remain in position. Once we have this in location, then we could place this hub, this high clutch hub. That's for the front high clutch hub. And don't forget, we have this roller bearing on that side, and we have a bearing on this side. This is another thrust bearing. So in here is where you want to lubricate with the Vaseline or the trans gel before assembling. Always. This is the high clutch drum assembly. So with all the clutch in line, we want to place this onto the hub. Careful attention must be taken that you also have a race inside here. You see that washer? That's for a needle roller bearing. So this is how the assembly will look when it's in the transmission. But the most important part that I want you to identify with is when you're going to place this reverse clutch drum to finalize the assembly. What you want is that when the clutch are all in line, you want it to interlock like this, and this will let you know that the assembly has been complete and is final. Then the band can be placed on the reverse drum. Here's what needs to be understood is this input shaft will be placed into this sun gear, and this part of the spline will lock with the high clutch drum assembly. So once this is placed in position and it's locked onto the high drum assembly, on this other side we will have the sun gear, and this is how the assembly will look with the input shaft assembled. Let's go ahead and place this assembly into the transmission to complete the rebuild. Another important part is when you take a look at this input shaft, you will see it has a pilot that has to sit into the rear output shaft. There's also a bushing in here that may require inspection in the event it should show evidence of excess wear and tear. Also on this shaft we have some holes for distributing oil to the high clutch drum assembly, the reverse clutch assembly, and it also, there's a pilot hole through the shaft that sends oil from the front pump, and that oil is connected with the rear oil passageway. So the center of the shaft will have an oil pressure for distributing along the transmission driveline. Now it's time for us to place this sun gear. I want to make sure this smooth side is against this needle roller bearing. Very, very important. And the other side will receive this thrust washer. So you'll have to center that. Then we want to place this planetary, this front planetary, into location. So we have to make sure that this bearing is seated on here when it's to be fitted in location. So we're going to place this here for now so it does not fall out of the planetary. Now, like I said, this here will have to drop down into this forward drum assembly like a pot lid. It will have to be closed. So sometime you're going to have to place the input shaft in rotating the planetary to get them to align so this cover could drop to its lowest point. Now you have to also remember to check the alignment of the needle roller bearing when this is to be installed. The easy way to manipulate this will be to rotate the output shaft, and it will be able to disconnect. So this is what's causing the problem. The roller bearing is preventing the planetary from seating perfectly. And that's what we're looking for. We want a nice flush drop with the planetary. Now the next part would be this front planetary. We have the race on the side. Then we want to place this hub. This is the high clutch hub. So that's locked into position. Then we're going to place the high clutch drum assembly. Once that high drum clutch assembly has been placed, then we will install the reverse drum, making sure it locks with the front planetary. So now you have to be careful when you're working up here, because the edge of the transmission, you will notice, is very sharp, and it could eventually cut your hand. And that's what we want. It's perfectly installed. Now we have the band that we have to place these two locks into. The bottom one is an actuator, and the top is an adjuster. So you see these grooves, both sides has one, have to get placed in location. Now it's time for us to adjust the band, place the gasket. We'll go here. So you have to make sure you align all your holes so the passageway could push through into the front pump. Now you're going to know it's aligned because you're going to be able to see this part here has an opening for the input shaft speed sensor. Adjusting of the transmission band is very important. This is the part where you want to make your adjustment. When the band is to be removed, this threaded stud will have to be released. And what you need to do is you just need to turn it down all the way to where the factory had this nut locked on this threaded stud. So that will be approximately 5 to 6 thread count for most transmission. Once you have that thread count on the stud, you will lock this nut, and this will have your band adjusted for operation. If you find the band is too slack, the stud could always be tightened to approximately 4 to 3 threads remaining on the exterior, and this will give you a much quicker action for braking and stopping the reverse drum. Before installing the transmission bell housing with the pump, we want to test the piston operation inside of the drum. So we will lubricate this area with a lot of Vaseline or trans gel also in this area to seal the passageway between the seal so the air will not escape when it's being placed into the third hole that's over here. You will take your air nozzle at 90 psi and you will inject air into this hole and watch for the piston inside this drum to move forward, and when that air is released, it will drop back as far as it can because the retainer spring inside will push the piston back. So to test the operation for the piston inside the reverse clutch drum, you will apply air pressure at approximately 90 psi to the third hole on the transmission front pump. Now we want to place this high clutch drum assembly into location. So we'll have to apply the same amount of grease and Vaseline in the center where it's sealed against the pump shaft. For operation of the clutch piston in the high clutch drum assembly, you will apply air to the second hole from the discharge, and this will operate the piston, moving it forward when 90 psi of air is being injected. When that air is released, the piston will move back because the retainer spring ring will push it back for releasing the clutches. So that is a way for testing if your piston and seal is installed successfully before assembling it into the transmission. And also you don't want to test drive the vehicle to find out that the piston and the seal was damaged during installation. So you always want to perform this test. The same test can be performed to the overrun forward drum clutch assembly when it's bolted into the transmission case, and we're going to take a look at where the air would be applied for activating the clutch, the two piston for the clutches inside the overrun forward clutch drum. In the video link description, you will see a video on how to remove the valve control body from the transmission case housing under the sump oil pan. Applying 90 psi of air to these ports will be able to activate the piston for the clutches inside the low and reverse brake drum assembly and the forward overrun clutch hardware drum. So by applying 90 psi in this port, you will be able to hear the piston move back and forth inside the forward drum assembly. Applying 90 psi to this port, you will be able to hear the piston engage and disengage for the low and reverse brake clutch hardware inside the transmission casing. Here is where we want to take a look at inside of the front pump. And what we're going to be looking for here is, we want to look at the seal. So you can also notice careful attention has to be taken in identifying parts. We have a plastic washer that sits here. Don't want to lose this. So that's the inside of the pump, and this is the passageway that sends the pressure into the transmission case for activating the clutches and the valve body, placing a pressure in the passageway. Now when we look inside of the pump, you see this is a seal, the seal against the transmission case, and we have this heavy spring. We have the outer housing for the pump. This is a dowel pin. Then we have an eccentric ring. This is a centering ring for keeping all these vanes, these fins that you see on the pump, to keep it in position. Now when you look at these vanes, you're not supposed to let them fall out, but most of the time they are. Don't fool yourself. You just have to be careful when assembling it back together. You see the two corners? Well, that is what has to interlock with the torque converter. So this is the torque converter. We can see those two sides, and that's where this will be when it gets installed into the transmission. This part, this rotor with the vane, will lock to the torque converter, so when the engine is started, everything is spinning, the front pump and the torque converter pump. When we take a look at the outer ring for the pump, we can see we have a hard steel ring, and that has to be in position. Now another thing is to see a lot of people talk about is this arm. They say something about the bottom here. It's going to be very sharp. In this case it is, because when you place your finger along this edge, it's extremely sharp. So most of the time what you're going to want to do here is to pass a sandpaper, deburring the sharpness, making it curve nice and smooth like the other side, because this sharpness will get stuck on the surface of the aluminum when it has to move back and forth. Also pay attention, there is a seal on this end, and there's a long one on the top. There's nothing on the bottom. So that's the only thing that will have to be done here, is you pass the sandpaper along this edge, the sharp edge, and the back, removing that knife edge, preventing any misalignment or causing the door to get stuck. So you have to be very careful, make sure these seals are in position when you're placing it back in location. Now we're going to take a look at assembling this, and what we want is this part to be down with this groove facing up. So the first thing we want to do is place this ring in location. Then we're going to place the rotor hub, and now you have to remember when you're placing this, you don't want this ring to fall out. And that's what's going to have the likeliness to do. This is where you're going to have to use the Vaseline or trans gel for adhesive, holding it together. Once that outer ring can be placed in location and you have the center ring here, now you're going to want to take a look at the vane and pass your finger along the edge. And what you want is the smooth edge on the outside. So we take a look at this, we could see there's a line in the middle, and you can see the friction side is on the left side. So that's what we're going to look for, the left side. All the friction side we want to place into location, and it has to be flat with the hub. If it's not flat with the hub, that means it could be sitting on that center ring. So this is how you will be able to assemble the pump. You have to take a careful inspection and look at the mark when you're placing this vane back into location. Sometimes we call a fin because it's like just propelling the fluid, and that's what you will find in a fish is a fin propelling itself with fins in the water. But some people like to call it a vane. Don't see how it is a vane, because a vein would be an artery, a channel for carrying fluid. And this acts more like a propeller blade. Once you got all the vanes installed, you just have to keep rotating it, and eventually they'll drop all into the slot, and then you will have them center like this with this ring is what propelling them out towards the wall and keeping them in position. The next part is to install the spring onto this outer ring with the pump. So we're going to have to place this like that and take this. This is like a spacer or washer. So all going to be installed together. Now this is a very tough spring for installing. This part I had to take to get the sandpaper to the edge. Now we want to get it back into position, so we want to check on these seals. And what we want to do is we want to make sure you release the pressure from this spring so we could drop this door in position with its dowel pin. Now once that's in position, you want to check your seal, make sure it's nice and seat. Check the movement. So this is complete inspecting and refurbishing the pump. Now what we want to do here is we want to place this part back, and this is where we had those plastic seal. We want to make sure it's not damaged. So we're going to have to look for the alignment of this area here with this area, placing the rear of the pump, replacing all the bolts. And you want to make sure you torque the bolts in a cross reference always, but before you do so, just make sure that the rear face of the pump is seated firmly All the passageway in the transmission needs to be blown out with high pressure air to make sure that any restriction or object is removed. Now it's time for us to place the front pump and the bell housing together into the transmission, paying careful attention to this needle roller bearing, making sure that it stays in this cavity when the bell housing is to be flipped upside down for installation, and you do not want to damage these oil seals. And don't forget this plastic washer that sits against the pump face. That's this plastic washer right here. So that's complete. The rebuild inspection for the Nissan RE4R01A, also B transmission. The B would be a transmission with a different valve body, and it's most likely in the Skyline. You also have the RL4R01A, which is a non-electronic transmission, and that is controlled by a TV cable from the throttle body. What needs to be understood here is these hydraulic passageway with the discharge and the inlet for the front pump takes its inlet from here, places the discharge here. Now these hydraulic passageway, like I said, are connected to these passageway that goes into the valve body to be controlled by the shift solenoid, and then it will be released in the rear of the transmission case for controlling the reverse, brake, clutch hardware, the overrun clutch hardware, and the forward clutch hardware. The reverse drum and the front high clutch drum are activated by hydraulic pressure from the pump send from this passageway into the center shaft for activating the clutches in the reverse drum, and below is the high clutch drum assembly. All the lubrication for the transmission is done at the torque converter, where oil is sent down this pilot hole to the rear outlet shaft, and that oil is used for lubricating the assembly, bearing, and bushing. Now you might be asking yourself, how does he have this transmission placed in the upright position? Well, I'm going to show you that later on. What you need to look at right now is this transmission bell housing and its passageway that's related to the transfer case. You want to make sure these passageway are aligned. Another important part, very important, is this needle roller bearing. You notice this bearing is seated inside of this cavity, but most of the time it will have the tendency to fall out, and you will want to use the Vaseline or Transgel for holding it in the cavity when this bell housing is to be flipped upside down for installation. You're also going to notice there's a cast iron front pump bolted to that aluminum housing. But when you're installing the pump, you want to make sure, like I said, all these passageway here align with the passageway on the transmission case, and you want to look through the bolt holes from the top while you're easing this down into the transmission case, so you could have a perfect alignment of the bolt holes. Now also notice, forgot around the edge, there's a oil seal. This is also very important. And we also have force seal here. The plastic seal, just like the inner race for that forward drum assembly when we were installing the tail shaft. This is when you want to place all your bolts into location. And don't forget to torque the bolts to the factory recommended foot-pound. Once the bolts have been torqued, the bell housing will seat perfectly against the transmission case. This is the input shaft. On the end of the input shaft where it installs into the torque converter, we have a oil seal. There's a rubber ring on the end. So this is the end that we want to place into the transmission. Making sure it seats properly. That is not properly. It should drop much further. So that is what we want to see when the input shaft is seated. I look at the transmission housing. You will notice there is a seal on the input shaft stator. That's an oil seal for the front pump that's replaceable and can sometimes leak between the engine and the transmission housing. You will also notice there is a crankshaft position sensor for engine value or ECM value and reference. The most important part for control on the right side of the transmission is the shift linkage. You want to make sure you can walk this linkage through all its position in reference with the transmission neutral safety switch. These bell housing bolts will need some sealant on the threads. When installing, you will have to place some silicone in this area to prevent transmission fluid from leaking out of the bell housing. On the right side of the transmission case, we have the oil cooler tube inlet oil hole, the transmission dipstick, the neutral safety and gear shift switch for the TCM. We also have the connection for the shift solenoid. At the rear, this would be the forward clutch pressure. So this is another point where you can apply air for checking the pressure and applying the piston for the forward and overrun clutch drum assembly. On the tail, we have the VSS sensor and the identification tag. Pay careful attention to the output shaft. Inside where this output shaft is located, there is a bearing which also need inspection and a removable seal. On the left side tail of the transmission is the output shaft speed sensor and the oil cooler tube outlet passageway. Let me take a look at this bolt here. This is third and fourth gear, neutral and reverse accumulator back pressure. These three plugs here can be removed and checked for pressure. The top one will be servo 3-speed operation room temperature. This one will be servo 2-speed operation room temperature and servo 4-speed operation room temperature. Room pressure. At the top of the transmission, we will find a vent tube for ventilating air from the transmission fluid. We also have where the input shaft speed sensor would be installed, and this is the adjustment for the reverse drum brake band. The part that could be disassembled, separated, is this bell housing from the oil pump front housing, and that will be separated from in here. You will have to smack this inside or the bell housing with a mallet so this aluminum casing can be separated from this aluminum casing. That we did not do because it wasn't necessary for doing so, but if you need to swap the bell housing, in the event you should be doing an engine swap and the bell housing is different, Most likely it will bolt with this pattern, but the pattern on the outside of the bell housing might be different. So the bell housing is swappable on this transmission, which is the RE4R01A, also the RL4R01A. This is how you're going to remove the front pump from the bell housing, so you could interchange the bell housing with the transmission for performing engine swap that's not belong to this bell housing. So you want to take a punch and place it here, and then you're just going to hit the punch with the mallet. You want to use a rubber mallet, and it will fall out in a bucket. Now you have the bell housing separated from the front pump, and the transmission can be used for other application beside a VG or VQ engine swap.